Imagine that the worst fear a person can have is not pain, but anticipation. Throughout history, there have been methods of punishment in which a person could remain conscious for hours or even days, knowing that there was no escape. Some of these methods were considered legal, some were considered fair, and some were used publicly as a warning to everyone else. Today, we will talk about the 20 most horrific methods of torture in human history, and many of them will turn out to be much worse than you think. Warning: the video discusses difficult historical topics. The descriptions are for informational purposes only. Torture was almost never just punishment. It was used as an instrument of power, a means of suppression, and a demonstration of complete control over a person. In many eras, it was important not only to punish, but to break, humiliate, and show that human life is completely dependent on the will of the state, ruler, or court. And the first method we will start with is considered one of the most ancient. Method 1. Beheading era. Ancient world, Middle Ages. Status: quick and honorable execution. Beheading is often perceived as instant death, and that is why it has long been considered a humane method of execution, especially for the nobility. But in practice, everything depended on the person wielding the weapon. If the blow was not precise enough, the execution turned into an agonizing wait for the next blow. Sometimes several attempts were required, while the crowd watched in complete silence. Another important point is that beheadings were almost always carried out in public. It was not just a sentence for one person. It was a message to everyone else. The power is absolute. And yet, compared to the next method, beheading was considered almost merciful. Method 2. Wheeling. Era: Antiquity, Middle Ages. Purpose: not death, but demonstration of suffering. Wheeling was used not so much for execution as for demonstrative intimidation. The person was tied to a large wheel, after which the punishment could continue for a very long time. The point was not to end it quickly, but to make the process last as long as possible and be visible to everyone. In some regions, the condemned person was left on the wheel in the square, and every passerby could see the consequences of the sentence. This method particularly highlights one important feature of historical torture. The suffering of one person was seen as a means of controlling thousands. But physical pain is only part of the story. Next, we will look at methods that affected the mind rather than the body. If previous methods relied on force and exemplary punishment, then later the authorities began to use something more subtle and terrifying: a person's helplessness in the face of their own body and mind. Sometimes this required neither weapons nor blood. Method 3. Water torture. Era: Antiquity, Middle Ages. Special feature: fear is stronger than pain. Water torture took many forms and was used in different cultures. Its essence lay not in instant harm, but in the loss of control. The person was restrained and forced to face the feeling that they no longer had control over their breathing. Even if the physical harm was minor, the psychological effect was devastating. The main thing here is anticipation. Every second seemed like the last, and that is what broke people faster than any blows. It is no coincidence that such methods were used primarily for interrogations. Fear made even those who were prepared to endure pain talk. But the next method went even further. It could last for days and did not require any physical impact at all. Method 4. Deprivation of food and water. Era: Ancient world, Middle Ages. Purpose: slow exhaustion. Deprivation of food and water was considered one of the "two forms of punishment." The executioner did not need to touch the victim. It was enough to simply wait. The first few days, the person still had hope. Then came weakness, disorientation, and a complete feeling of dependence on those on the other side of the door. This method was often used not as a form of execution, but as a means of pressure. The person was made to understand that their life was completely in the hands of others, and any decision could be postponed indefinitely. Historians note that it was this type of torture that broke people the most, because it destroyed the will, not the body. And yet the authorities sought ways to make the suffering even more visible. When fear and exhaustion ceased to have the desired effect, the authorities moved on to the next level. Now the torture was not only directed at the victim, they were made an example of. It was important for the person to suffer in front of others, because public humiliation was more memorable than any pain. Method 5. Crucifixion Era, Antiquity. Meaning, absolute deprivation of dignity. Crucifixion was not just a way to take a person's life, it was a form of total humiliation. The person was deliberately put on display, by roads, in squares, in places where people gathered. Death might not come right away, and that was part of the punishment. But the key thing was not even physical suffering. Crucifixion deprived a person of movement, protection, privacy, human dignity in the eyes of the crowd. The victim became not a person, but a warning. Therefore, this method was almost always used on those whom they wanted to make a symbol of suppressed resistance. However, there were forms of torture where even the presence of a crowd was unnecessary. Humiliation took place differently, more quietly, but no less effectively. Method 6. Isolation Era, from antiquity to modern times. Purpose: destruction of personality. Isolation is considered one of the most underrated forms of torture in history. It involves almost no physical impact, and that is precisely why it worked so well. The person was deprived of communication, light, sense of time, any information about what was happening. The days began to blur together. Thoughts went round and round in circles. Consciousness gradually lost its footing. Historical sources describe how people who survived prolonged isolation often broke down even without the use of force. This method was particularly valued because it left no traces. It did not require witnesses. It destroyed a person from within. And yet, even isolation was not considered the limit. At this stage in history, torture ceased to be simply a punishment. It became a bargaining chip. The person is made to understand that the suffering can be stopped if they agree to obey, confess, or renounce themselves. Method 7. Suspension by the limbs era, Middle Ages and modern times. Meaning, helplessness and control. This method was used in many countries and took various forms. The person was restrained in such a way that they completely lost the ability to control their body. At first glance, the punishment might not seem particularly cruel, but it was its duration that made it so destructive. Over time, the following symptoms appeared: severe fatigue, disorientation, a feeling of complete dependence on those watching. The main thing was not the pain, but the realization that you could neither fall nor change position, nor stop what was happening. This method was often used during interrogations because it created the feeling that the authorities were controlling every second of your existence. But if suspension gradually broke the body, the next method was aimed at breaking the perception of time. Method 8. Forced waiting era, various periods. Feature: fear of the unknown. In this case, the person knew that punishment was inevitable, but did not know when exactly. They could be left in a cell and told that the sentence would be carried out soon. Sometimes it was hours, sometimes it was days. Historians note that many people broke down at this stage, not from pain, but from constant anticipation, when every sound seemed like a signal of the end. This method was particularly effective because it forced the person to create fear in their own mind. But the authorities did not limit themselves to waiting and helplessness. In the next part, we will move on to methods where humiliation was combined with direct influence, and the audience played a key role. When fear and anticipation had done their job, the authorities moved on to the next step. Now the suffering had to be seen, because spectators are part of the punishment mechanism. Method 9. Public humiliation. Era, from antiquity to modern times. Meaning, to break a person in front of society. This method did not always involve physical violence. Sometimes it was enough to deprive a person of name, status, human dignity. The condemned could be put on display in the square, forced to remain in one position for hours, or turned into an object of ridicule and contempt. The most important thing here was the gaze of the crowd. The person understood that they were not seen as an individual, but as an example of what happens to those who break the rules. Sources say that many perceived such punishment as more severe than physical suffering, because after it was almost impossible return to one's former life. But there were methods where humiliation was combined with a complete loss of control over one's own body. Method 10. Immobilization and immobility. Era, Middle Ages. Purpose, complete dependence. In this case, the person was placed in a device or position from which they could not escape on their own. At first, it seemed that nothing terrible was happening, but over time, the following occurred. Tension, fatigue, loss of sensation in their own body. The person stopped understanding how much time had passed and how much more they had to endure. This method was used as a form of pressure because it deprived people of the most basic thing, the ability to move and change the situation. Historians note that it was precisely immobility that often caused the most severe psychological breakdown, and yet there were still methods ahead that were considered extreme measures. They were used when all other methods had failed. At this point, we come to methods that were considered extreme even by the standards of their time. They were not used often, but that is precisely why they had the strongest effect. They were talked about, feared, and remembered for years. Method 11. Punishment by fire. Era, Antiquity and the Middle Ages. Meaning, demonstration of absolute power. Fire has long been perceived as a symbol of purification and punishment. That is why it was used not only as a means of destruction, but also as a public sign of final judgment. Punishment by fire was rarely carried out in secret. It almost always took place in front of others, because the fear of such an outcome was supposed to keep society from disobeying. It is important to note that the authorities did not demonstrate fury here, but rather their cold right to dispose of a person's life. However, there were methods where suffering was not quick and final, but turned into a long process of waiting for the end. Method 12. The wheel. As a warning, era, Middle Ages. Purpose, intimidation through duration. The wheel was used not only as a means of punishment, but also as a constant reminder. The condemned person was left in such a position so that he could be seen from afar, sometimes at the entrance to the city, sometimes in the central square. The point was not the moment of execution itself, but the fact that it continued over time and remained part of the urban environment. People passed by, children asked questions, and fear took root for a long time. This method worked precisely because it turned human suffering into an element of everyday life. But ahead of us lie methods where the main weapon was not spectacle, but the complete destruction of a person's inner world. Not all torture left marks on the body. Some were more dangerous precisely because they destroyed a person imperceptibly. After them, the victim could come out alive, but no longer the same. Method 13. Sensory deprivation. Era, from the Middle Ages to modern times. Purpose, to deprive a person of their footing in reality. Sensory deprivation consisted of depriving a person of their usual sensations. This could be absence of light, silence, a monotonous environment, inability to orient oneself in time. At first, consciousness tried to hold on. Then the breakdowns began. Thoughts became confused, time lost its meaning, and reality became unstable. Historical accounts show that such methods often led to complete submission without the use of force. The authorities valued this method precisely because it did not require constant intervention. People broke themselves, left alone with emptiness. But if deprivation destroyed perception, the next method struck at the very sense of self-worth. Method 14. Forced self-accusation. Era: Middle Ages. Meaning, to make a person turn away from themselves. This method was often used during interrogations. A person was forced to publicly or formally admit guilt, even if they were unaware of it or had not committed the act. It was not the confession itself that was important, but the process. The victim was reminded again and again of their alleged mistakes, their shame, the consequences for their loved ones. Over time, the person began to doubt themselves. Resistance disappeared because the internal conflict became unbearable. Historians note that after such methods, many agreed to any conditions, just to stop the pressure. And yet, there were forms of torture that combined psychological and physical effects. These were considered the final step before the final sentence. Now we come to the methods that were the final chords of power. This was not just punishment, it was a complete demonstration of power, after which the victim was never the same again. Method 15. Crucifixion Era: Antiquity and the Middle Ages. Purpose: physical and psychological destruction. Crucifixion is a symbol of ultimate power over a person. The body was stretched out and fastened to the cross, leaving the victim unable to move. Every breath became torture. Time stretched into an endless wait for the end. But it was not only physical pain. The public nature of crucifixion turned suffering into a demonstration of powerlessness. Crucifixion showed that power was supreme, and no one would escape without a lesson. Method 16. The Iron Maiden Era: Middle Ages. Meaning, a combination of fear and inevitability. The Iron Maiden was a symbol of absolute control. A metal sarcophagus with spikes inside turned death into a process that no one could speed up or stop. A person was placed inside, and each spike was designed to maximize slow suffering. This machine worked not only physically, it destroyed the psyche because the person saw the inevitability. Many descriptions emphasize that the fear of the Iron Maiden was sometimes stronger than the pain itself. Method 17. Explosive Torture Era: Late Middle Ages and Modern Times. Purpose: shock and intimidation. The use of explosives as a means of punishment was rare, but always left an indescribable horror. Death was not necessarily instantaneous. Many victims survived the explosion, but suffered terrible consequences from internal injuries. Historians note that this method worked as a terrible warning to all who witnessed it. Here, the authorities no longer negotiated with the body. They destroyed the entire human experience, creating a memory of fear. At this stage, torture ceased to be merely a means of pressure. It became definitive proof that a person was completely deprived of choice. Here, pain and fear work together, and this is what makes these methods particularly destructive. Method 18. Sharp Instruments. Era: Antiquity and the Middle Ages. Purpose: to break resistance through fear. The use of red-hot objects was widespread, not only because of the pain they caused. Much more important was the anticipation. The person saw the instrument in advance. They understood what was going to happen, and it was this awareness that broke their will even before the punishment began. Historical sources show that often the mere sight of such instruments was enough to extract confessions. This method was valued by the authorities for its effectiveness. It took almost no time, but left a deep mark on the memory. But even this was not considered the limit. There were methods that caused a person to lose not only their strength, but also their sense of self. Method 19. Forced immobility in a confined space era. Middle Ages. Purpose: destruction through claustrophobia and time. A person was placed in a confined space where they could not stand up straight, turn around, or change their body position. At first, the consciousness tried to resist, but over time, the following appeared: panic, disorientation, a feeling of complete helplessness. This method rarely required constant monitoring. It was enough to close the door and wait. Historians note that such punishments often led to complete mental exhaustion, even if the physical damage was minimal. And now we come to the last method on our list, the one that sums up the whole logic of torture as an instrument of power. All previous methods differed in form, but they had one thing in common: the desire to completely subjugate a person. And the last method on our list shows that sometimes no physical impact was needed at all to achieve this. Method 20. Complete isolation and forgetfulness. Era: from antiquity to modern times, meaning to erase a person from the world. This method was considered particularly cruel precisely because it was silent. The person was not taken out into the square. They were not made an example of. They were simply excluded from reality, without information, without communication, without understanding, whether they were still alive to the world or not. Over time, the sense of time disappeared. Then, the sense of one's own significance. And then, the personality itself began to dissolve. Historians note that for many, such punishment was more terrible than any execution, because the person died not in body, but in memory. It was here that torture achieved its goal completely. The victim disappeared, even if he continued to breathe. The history of torture is not just a list of cruel methods. It is a mirror of how far power can go when human dignity ceases to matter. It is important to understand that torture almost never arose from chaos. It was part of the system, the law, the order of its time. That is why it is so important to study it, not to shock, and not to be horrified by the past, but to remember that any society that begins to justify violence for the sake of control will sooner or later lose its humanity. The stories of people who survived these trials remind us of something else: the incredible resilience of the human spirit. Even in the darkest conditions, people are capable of maintaining their inner resistance, their memory of themselves, and their desire to remain human. And this is the main lesson of all the most horrific methods of torture in human history. When we talk about all these methods, it is important to understand one thing: torture never existed on its own. It was not a random manifestation of cruelty or the whim of individual rulers. In most eras, torture was part of a system of control, oppression, and fear. For ancient and medieval societies, pain was the language of power. It replaced laws, courts, and evidence. Where there was no presumption of innocence, torture became an instrument of "for." It was believed that suffering could force a person to tell the truth, even if that truth did not exist. And that is what made torture particularly terrifying. It destroyed not only the body, but also the very idea of justice. It is important to understand that in many cultures, such methods were not considered out of the ordinary. On the contrary, they were perceived as a normal part of public order. Public executions and tortures attracted crowds. People came to watch not only out of fear, but also out of curiosity. Over time, another person's pain ceased to be perceived as a tragedy and became a spectacle. This is how cruelty became commonplace. Torture served several purposes at once. It punished, it intimidated, it demonstrated power. But most importantly, it broke down internal resistance. People were made to understand that they had no control over their bodies or their destinies. This feeling of helplessness was more frightening than the pain itself. The psychological effect was particularly devastating. Many victims confessed to crimes they did not commit. Others lost their sense of reality, time, and their own identity. Even those who survived rarely returned to their former lives. Fear, anxiety, and constant anticipation of danger accompanied them for the rest of their days. But history shows another side. Despite all these horrors, the human spirit was not completely broken. In every era, there were people who endured torture and still retained their inner identity, sometimes silently, sometimes at the cost of their own lives. Their steadfastness became a symbol of resistance to a system in which violence was considered the norm. Over time, attitudes toward torture began to change. Gradually, humanity began to realize that pain does not create justice, and fear does not give birth to truth. Ideas of human rights, humane justice, and the prohibition of cruel punishments emerged. It was a long and difficult path, but it became possible precisely because the horrors of the past could not be ignored. And yet history teaches us an important lesson. Cruelty never disappears completely. It only changes form. Where control disappears, where power becomes absolute, and where people lose their value, violence always returns. That is why it is so important to remember these dark pages of history, not for the sake of shock, but for the sake of understanding. Remembering torture is not glorifying pain. It is a reminder of what the rejection of humanity leads to, of how easily society can become accustomed to the suffering of others if it is justified by fear, ideology, or orders from above. Today, we live in a world where the words human rights sound familiar. But behind these words lie centuries of pain, mistakes, and ruined lives. And if we forget the price at which these ideas were formed, we risk finding ourselves once again on the brink, where violence will be justified by necessity. Stories of torture are not just tales of the past. They are a mirror that reflects human nature, the ability to inflict pain, and the ability to resist it. The choice between fear and compassion, between power and responsibility. And perhaps the most important conclusion is this: no system built on suffering can be considered strong. The true strength of a society is measured not by how it punishes the weak, but by how it protects human dignity. Let these stories remain not only a grim reminder, but also a warning, so that the darkness of the past never becomes the norm of the future, so that pain does not become a spectacle, and so that humanity always remains above fear. If you care about preventing such pages of history from repeating themselves, please support this video. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new historical analyses. And remember, knowledge of the past is one of the few ways to protect the future. Realistic, slowly floating clouds above an ancient fortress, mysterious music, light haze and twilight, animation of movement. Realistic, an old book with worn pages opening, pages turning slowly, a dark background and soft torchlight, animation of pages turning realistic, silhouette of a person against the backdrop of ancient city walls, wind-rustling fabric, slight movement of clouds and leaves, animation with smooth camera zoom. Realistic, ancient chains slowly swaying in the dim light, light dust in the air, animation of smooth movement of light and shadow. Realistic, camera slowly flying through an empty prison corridor with torches on the walls, faint flickering of fire, light misty haze, animation of camera movement. Realistic, medieval town square at dawn, stone platform, figure of a man on his knees, executioner nearby with sword lowered, faces of spectators in shadow, mist in the air, cold muted color palette, emphasis on tense anticipation, no blood, historical accuracy. Realistic, close-up of a person's hands tied with rope, crowd and wooden buildings of a medieval town visible in the background, atmosphere of silence before the sentence, expression of fear and humility, cinematic lighting, realistic, scene of public execution without direct violence, silhouettes of people against a gray sky, raised sword in a static position, focus on the emotions of the spectators and a sense of power, historical setting. Realistic, view from the crowd, central figure on the platform, guards with spears, tense composition, lack of dynamics, sense of inevitability, gloomy atmosphere. Realistic, symbolic scene after the sentence, empty platform, sword lying on the ground, dispersing crowd, sense of completion and fear, muted colors, historical style, realistic. Large wooden wheel in the town square, tied figure of a man, guards nearby, spectators at a distance, emphasis on the scale of the structure, no violent details, historical scene. Realistic, view of the wheel from below, silhouettes of houses and sky, body secured with ropes, expression of helplessness, static composition, tense atmosphere. Realistic, medieval town square, wheel installed as a permanent fixture, passers-by watching with concern, sense of public intimidation, subdued lighting. Realistic, close-up of the face of the person on the wheel, fatigue and despair in the eyes, lack of movement, slow passage of time, historical realism. Realistic, long shot, wheel visible from afar at the entrance to the city, travelers stop, anxious feeling of warning, gloomy landscape, realistic, dark room, man tied to a wooden chair, vessel with water nearby, tense atmosphere, emphasis on fear in the eyes, no direct violence. Realistic, close-up of a person's face, drops of water on the skin, eyes wide open, feeling of loss of control, dim lighting, historical interior. Realistic, interrogation scene, figures of executioners in the shadows, victim in the center of the frame. Water as a symbol of threat, cinematic contrast. Realistic, side view, fixed body, vessel with water in the executioner's hands, pause before action, maximum tension, no cruelty. Realistic, symbolic shot, overturned vessel with water on the stone floor, shadow of a person on the wall, feeling of fear and anticipation. Realistic, stone prison cell, man sitting against the wall, empty bowl on the floor, faint ray of light, feeling of loneliness and time. Realistic, top view, emaciated figure on a cold floor, walls without windows, minimalism, silence, and hopelessness. Realistic, a cell with a narrow window through which almost no light passes, a person staring into the void, emphasis on psychological exhaustion. Realistic, close-up of hands trembling over an empty bowl, stone floor, lack of food as the main visual emphasis. Realistic, prison door closes, light disappears, person remains in darkness, symbol of slow exhaustion. Realistic, ancient road outside the city, wooden cross erected by the roadside, figure of a person fixed in place, crowd watching from a distance, no violent details. Realistic, side view, silhouette of the cross against the sky. The man is motionless, a sense of public humiliation, historical realism. Realistic, close-up of face, fatigue and humility. Sunlight, blurred crowd in the background, emotional emphasis. Realistic, long shot, several crosses by the road, travelers passing by. Atmosphere of fear and authority. Realistic, symbolic shot, shadow of a cross on the ground, slowly moving clouds, sense of time and inevitability. Realistic, dark stone chamber without windows, a man sitting alone by the wall, a faint beam of light from above, a sense of lost time, cold color palette, historical authenticity. Realistic, view from inside the cell, massive door with a bolt, man turned away from it, absolute silence, feeling of isolation and oblivion. Realistic, close-up of a face in semi-darkness, empty gaze, lack of emotion, soft shadows, feeling of psychological breakdown. Realistic, Camera from above. Small figure in a large empty space. Walls visually oppressive, symbol of loss of identity. Realistic, symbolic scene. A torch slowly burning out at the entrance to the cell. A person remains in darkness, a feeling of the end of connection with the world. Realistic, medieval dungeon. Person suspended by limbs, body motionless, guards standing aside, dim torchlight, no violent details. Realistic, side view. Elongated body in a static position. Ropes are taut, expression of fatigue and helplessness. Gloomy atmosphere. Realistic. Close-up of hands that have lost their strength. Ropes digging into the skin. Emphasis on tension. Historical realism. Realistic. Distant view. Dark room. Suspended figure almost merges with the shadows. Feeling of complete loss of control. Realistic, symbolic shot. Drops of water fall on the stone floor beneath the motionless body. Slow passage of time. Realistic, prison cell. Man sitting on a bench. Door closed. Tense gaze into the void. Waiting for the unknown. Dim light. Realistic, prison corridor. Footsteps of guards behind the door. Man pressed against the wall. Fear and anticipation. Cinematic composition. Realistic, close-up of a face. Wide eyes. Sweat on the forehead. Silence before an unknown event. Realistic, view of a closed door with a small window. Light behind the door. A person in the shadows. A sense of inevitability. Realistic, symbolic scene. Flickering torchlight behind the wall. Shadow of the bars. Time seems to have stopped. Realistic, city square. A person standing on a platform surrounded by a crowd. All eyes on him. No physical violence. Strong social pressure. Realistic, close-up of spectators' faces. A mixture of contempt and curiosity. The man in the center of the frame looks down. Humiliation through the attention of the crowd. Realistic, side view. Man's posture is stiff. Security guards nearby. Crowd in the background is blurred. Emphasis on loneliness. Realistic, scene at sunset. Long shadows from people standing around. Person remains motionless. Atmosphere of shame and pressure. Realistic, symbolic shot. Empty square after punishment. Traces of the crowd's presence. Feeling of a ruined reputation. Realistic, medieval restraint device. Person fixed in a motionless position. Stone walls. Dim light. No violent details. Realistic, close-up of the face. Tension in the muscles. Inability to move. Feeling of dependence on an external force. Realistic, top view. Body fixed. Empty space around. Emphasized helplessness. Realistic, scene of prolonged waiting. Hourglass against the backdrop of a motionless person. Symbol of loss of control over time. Realistic, symbolic final frame. Motionless figure in dim light. Slowly fading light. Feeling of complete submission. Realistic, medieval square at dusk. Prepared bonfire without flames. Guards and silent crowd. Figure of a man in the distance. Feeling of cold formality and authority. Realistic, close-up of spectators' faces. Reflection of fire in their eyes. Tense anticipation. No direct violence. Historical authenticity. Realistic, side view. A man standing in front of a source of fire, his hands tied. The light of torches creating sharp shadows. A sense of final judgment. Realistic, long shot. Bonfire as the center of the composition. People lined up in a semicircle. Symbol of public intimidation. Gloomy palette. Realistic, symbolic shot. Smoke rising against a dark sky. Crowd gradually dissolving into shadows. Sense of finality. Realistic, large wooden wheel installed at the city wall. Man secured and left on display. Passers-by watching from a distance. No violent details. Realistic. View from afar. Wheel visible at the entrance to the city. Travelers stop. Fear as part of the landscape. Historical realism. Realistic. close-up of a person's face, emaciated expression, immobility, slow passage of time. Realistic, city life against the backdrop of the wheel. Merchants and residents pass by, suffering as part of everyday life. Realistic, symbolic shot, wheel against the backdrop of sunset. Long shadows, feeling of prolonged punishment. Realistic, dark room without windows. A person sitting in complete silence. Monotonous walls, lack of visual landmarks. Realistic, first-person view, hands in front of eyes in darkness, inability to determine space, feeling of loss of reality. Realistic, close-up of a face in dim light, unfocused gaze, signs of disorientation, soft shadows. Realistic, empty room, person lying motionless, absence of sound and movement, feeling of a vacuum. Realistic, symbolic shot, completely black background with a barely visible silhouette, feeling of a disappearing personality. Realistic, interrogation room, person standing before judges, tense atmosphere, emphasis on psychological pressure. Realistic, close-up of the face, doubt and inner conflict, eyes downcast, soft directional light. Realistic, scene of a confession being recorded, pen and paper on the table, hand trembling, symbol of self-denial. Realistic, side view, figure of a person between judges and guards, feeling of pressure from all sides. Realistic, symbolic shot, reflection of face in dark glass, distorted features, loss of identity. Realistic, ancient road outside the city, cross erected on a hill, human figure secured, crowd watching from afar. Realistic, view from below, silhouette of the cross against the sky, immobility and scale, feeling of ultimate power. Realistic, close-up of the face, fatigue and hopelessness, sunlight, blurred crowd. Realistic, distant view, several crosses by the road, travelers passing by, fear as a warning. Realistic, symbolic shot, shadow of the cross on the ground, slowly moving clouds, sense of stretched time. Realistic, medieval chamber, metal sarcophagus with slightly open doors, dim torchlight, human figure in front of the device, fear and inevitability in the atmosphere. Realistic, view from inside the chamber, massive metal structure dominates the frame, guards in the shadows, feeling of enclosed space. Realistic, close-up of a person's face before the doors close, tense gaze, cold gleam of metal, no violent details. Realistic, long shot, iron structure stands in the center of the room, stone walls, torches cast sharp shadows. Realistic, symbolic shot, closed metal form in darkness, silence, and a sense of finality. Realistic, underground room, man tied up, small explosive device nearby that has not been activated, guards retreating, feeling of extreme terror. Realistic, close-up of a face, fear and awareness of inevitability, tense lighting, no direct violence. Realistic, side view, human figure against a stone wall, threat object off to the side, silence before the event. Realistic, long shot, the room empties, the person remains alone, a sense of shock and finality. Realistic, symbolic shot, empty cell after punishment, dust falling in the air, uneasy silence. Realistic, medieval torture chamber, red-hot metal instruments lying on a stone table, fire illuminating the room. Realistic, close-up of the instruments, glow from the heat, reflection of fire on metal, anticipation stronger than action. Realistic, side view, a person looks at the instruments, fear and tension, without showing pain. Realistic, shadows from the instruments on the stone wall, fire flickering, psychological pressure. Realistic, symbolic shot, metal slowly cooling, silence after interrogation, feeling of broken resistance. Realistic, confined stone space, person inside, almost unable to move, dim light from above. Realistic, view from inside a confined space, walls close, heavy breathing, feeling of claustrophobia. Realistic, close-up of the face, tension and panic, beads of sweat, minimal lighting. Realistic, long shot, closed stone niche, guard leaves, complete isolation. Realistic, symbolic shot, darkness and barely discernible silhouette, feeling of time that has ceased to exist. Realistic, empty prison cell without windows, man sitting alone, absence of any landmarks. Realistic, rear view, human figure in the corner, walls with no signs of life, silence and oblivion. Realistic, close-up of a face, loss of emotion and individuality, a distracted gaze. Realistic, camera from above, small figure in empty space, feeling of complete disappearance. Realistic, symbolic final shot, empty camera without a person, closed door, complete erasure of presence. Realistic, empty medieval square after execution, silence and emptiness, soft evening light, symbol of oblivion and completion. Realistic, a lone person on top of a hill, watching the sunrise, a symbol of hope and the resilience of the human spirit. Realistic, an open old book on a stone table, sunbeams falling on the pages, a symbol of knowledge and memory of history. Realistic, an ancient torch goes out, darkness all around, symbolizing the end of an era of torture and violence. Realistic, the silhouette of a figure disappearing into the fog, symbolizing the disappearance of fear and human resistance. Realistic, stone walls of an old prison, light shining through cracks, symbolizing social change and progress. Realistic, a bell on the city tower, ringing at dawn, soft light, symbolizing memory and a warning for the future. Realistic, an empty cross on a hill, slightly illuminated by the morning sun, symbolizing humanity and the lessons of history. Realistic, an ancient scroll and inkwell on a table, dusty light through the window, symbolizing the preservation of knowledge and understanding of the past. Realistic, silhouette of a person with head raised above the fog, faint glow on the horizon, symbol of fortitude and victory over fear.